The vote to exile Earth passed. Then humanity made their rules known. The chamber was already decided before I sat down. I could see it, in the way the Velshari elder, Counselor Orath, held her long fingers flat on the ceremonial table. I could see it in the way the Draenei delegates leaned toward each other and whispered without bothering to use their translation earpieces. I could see it in the empty seat that had been assigned to me, a junior seat, pressed against the curved wall of the upper gallery, where observers sat. Not delegates, observers. My name is Yara Chen. I was Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Conclave for 11 years. On the day of the vote, I was 44 years old. I had gray beginning at my temples, and I was sitting in a chair that had no nameplate, no microphone, and no vote. They had never given us a vote. 60 years of provisional membership, and Earth had never once been allowed to stand on the main floor and speak as an equal. We submitted reports. We answered questions. We were studied the way you study an animal that keeps surprising you, not with admiration, but with a kind of tired fascination. The grand chamber of the Galactic Conclave was a beautiful room, if you could call something 300 meters across a room. The ceiling curved upward into a pale blue dome that shifted color with the ambient light of whatever star system hosted the session. That cycle, we were orbiting Vareth Prime, a gas giant the color of old copper, and the dome above me glowed amber and gold. 214 civilizations had representatives seated on the main floor. Their chairs, their breathing apparatus, their biofiltered personal domes, their translator units, all of it arranged in a precise spiral pattern that the Conclave had used for 40,000 years. 40,000 years. That number had always made humans uncomfortable in the wrong way. Most of my colleagues back home heard it and felt small. I heard it and felt suspicious. Anything that old and that unchanged was not wise. It was stuck. Counselor Orath rose to her full height, which was considerable. The Velshari were tall, pale, and built like something that had decided bones were optional. She had 4 arms, each one moving with a slow, deliberate grace that the other delegates always read as calm authority. I had spent enough time watching her to know it was rehearsed. She began to read. The charges against humanity had been submitted by a coalition of 9 civilizations, led by the Draenei Collective, who were Earth's closest neighbors in the galactic arm, and who had, from the moment of first contact, treated us with the polished condescension of someone trying to be kind while also holding their nose. The first charge was read in the Conclave's common tongue, then translated by the Chamber's system into every registered language simultaneously. My earpiece gave it to me in flat, precise English. Irrational aggression toward members of their own species, constituting a pattern of behavior incompatible with Conclave membership standards. I wrote it down. I had brought a paper notebook and a pen from Earth. Old technology. Reliable. Not something anyone would think to scan or intercept, because no one in that chamber had used paper in centuries. The second charge was read. Demonstrated pattern of environmental negligence resulting in documented near-extinction events caused by the species itself rather than by external forces. I wrote that one down too. The third charge. Refusal to develop unified species-wide governance, resulting in an inability to form binding agreements on behalf of the whole species. The fourth. Documented emotional instability, rendering predictive diplomatic modeling unreliable to a degree that constitutes a systemic risk to regional stability. I kept writing. Around me, the few human support staff who had been allowed into the gallery were silent. One of them, a young man named Owen, who had only joined the mission 6 months prior, was gripping the railing in front of him with both hands. I could see his knuckles from where I sat. I reached over and put my hand over his without looking up from my notes. He loosened his grip, slowly. I kept writing. The reading of charges took 40 minutes. There were 17 of them in total. I wrote down every single one. I did not write in anger. I did not write to argue against them later. I wrote them down because I wanted to remember this moment with perfect clarity. I wanted every word they used about us recorded in my own hand, in ink, on paper, so that nothing could be edited or softened or lost in a data archive somewhere. When Counselor Orath finished reading, she called for the vote. Each civilization's representative pressed a single panel in front of them, green for rejection of exile, red for approval. I watched the board. The Keth sovereignty, one of the oldest members of the conclave, voted red immediately. They had never liked us. They found our biology disturbing and had said so in a formal diplomatic paper that was technically titled An Academic Study. The Drenai Collective voted red. All 7 of their representatives pressed the panel at the same moment, which I suspected they had practiced. The Soran voted red. The Marathi voted red. The counselor from the Pellucid Web, which was not a species in any sense I could initially understand, but rather a distributed consciousness inhabiting approximately 4,000 orbiting platforms, voted red. Green votes came too. The Halm, who had been the first to make genuine contact with humanity and who had never stopped advocating for us, voted green. The Corvin Reach voted green. The Yavari Compact voted green. 14 others. When the final tally appeared on the dome above, rendered in enormous numerals of pale gold light, I read it without expression. 198 to 16. Exile approved. Counselor Orath looked up at the gallery. I think she expected to find me crying, or frozen, or already moving toward the exit with the specific kind of hurried, hunched walk that people use when they are trying to hold themselves together in public. I was writing in my notebook. I was writing the tally, the date, the exact local time as shown on the chamber clock, and the names of every civilization that had voted green. I wrote them carefully, in my best handwriting. Then I wrote one more line beneath the tally. I wrote, "They do not know what this means for them yet." Counselor Orath began to speak again, something about the formal terms of exile, restrictions on FTL lane access, removal from trade registries, a 90-day grace period for human vessels currently in conclave space to return to the Sol system. After that, any human ship found beyond the designated boundary would be classified as an unauthorized presence. Owen leaned close to me and whispered, "What do we do now?" I closed my notebook. I put the cap on my pen. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and looked out at 214 civilizations that had just decided we were not worth the trouble. I thought about my grandfather, who had been born in a village that flooded 3 times in his childhood. I thought about the way he described the 3rd flood, the worst one, the one that took the whole village to the waterline. He said that when they stood there looking at the water covering everything they had built, not one person sat down and gave up. They stood there, all of them, in cold water up to their knees, and they started talking about what to do next. Not whether, what. They rebuilt in 4 months. I picked up my notebook, tucked it under my arm, and looked at Owen. I said, "We go home." He blinked. "That is all?" I nodded. He asked, "Should we file a protest? Request a delay? There are procedures for a contested exile. We could invoke Article 47 of the Provisional Membership Charter and force a review period of up to 3 years before the exile takes full legal effect." I looked at him for a moment. He was young. He had studied conclave law for 6 years. He knew the procedures the way some people know religious texts, by heart, with genuine feeling. I said, "No." I walked toward the gallery exit. Behind me, I heard the chamber beginning to move into its next item of business. We were already yesterday's news. We had been handled, filed, resolved. The door to the gallery closed behind me with a soft sound. In the corridor, I opened my notebook one more time. I looked at the last line I had written. "They do not know what this means for them yet." Then I added 4 more words beneath it. "But we do." Good. The walk to the docking bay, where our ship waited, was long and quiet. Other species passed us in the corridors. Some looked at our group with something that might have been sympathy. Most did not look at all. We had been exiled less than an hour ago, and already we were invisible. I did not mind. Invisible was another word for unobserved, and unobserved was another word for free. I stepped onto the ship, handed my notebook to Owen, and told him to scan every page and encrypt the file under my personal code. He did it without questions, which meant he was learning. Then I went to the communications console and began composing the transmission to Earth. No one spoke while I wrote it. The room was completely quiet. I could hear the low hum of the ship's systems and the faint sound of the docking clamps releasing as we prepared to depart. I did not write the transmission in the formal diplomatic language that every report to Earth had used for 60 years. I wrote it in plain words. I wrote, "The vote passed. 198 to 16. We are formally exiled. We have 90 days to clear conclave space. When we are home, I have things to tell you. Do not panic. Do not send responses to the conclave. Do not file anything. Do not say anything. Be quiet. Be ready." I signed it with my name and sent it. Then I sat back in my chair and looked out the forward window at the amber sky of Vereth Prime. The conclave thought this was an ending. Every instinct I had, every piece of human history I had ever read, every story my grandfather had ever told me about water rising and people standing in it refusing to stop moving, told me something different. This was not an ending. This was the first day of something they were not going to like. I allowed myself one small, private smile. Then I got to work. The journey from Vereth Prime to Earth took 31 days on the ESV Steadfast, which was a mid-range diplomatic vessel, reliable and unremarkable. Exactly the kind of ship that does not draw attention. I had requested it specifically for that reason when I first took the ambassadorship. Reliable and unremarkable described my entire approach to representing Earth at the conclave, and for 11 years it had been the right strategy. Now the strategy was over. On the third day out from Vereth Prime, I called the ship's crew and the diplomatic staff into the main cabin. There were 14 of us total. Owen was there, still looking as though he had been struck by something heavy and had not yet had time to assess the damage. Our chief science advisor, a woman named Claire Okafor, sat with her arms folded and her expression completely neutral, which I had learned over 3 years meant she was thinking very hard. Our communications officer, a quiet man named Philip Strand, had a tablet in his lap and was already running numbers on something. I stood at the head of the table. I said, "I want to explain something to all of you before we arrive home. Not about what happened. You all know what happened. I want to explain what I think it means." Claire said, "Go ahead." I said, "For 60 years, we have been members of the conclave on provisional status. That provisional status came with certain obligations. We filed reports. We observed trade agreements. We accepted limits on what technologies we could develop independently. We stayed out of certain regions of space, designated as off-limits, pending membership approval. We submitted to cultural review panels. We participated in conclave education programs about our society, which always resulted in reports that described us as a developing civilization with significant potential but troubling instability." Philip looked up from his tablet. He said, "I remember reading one of those reports. They described human music as emotionally aggressive." Someone at the table laughed. It was a short, startled sound, the kind that escapes when people are wound too tight and something just slightly absurd cuts through. I said, "The point is that provisional membership was a cage. It was not presented as one. It was presented as an opportunity, a waiting room on the path to full membership, but it functioned as a cage. We limited ourselves. We accepted limits. We performed a version of humanity that we believed the conclave would find acceptable. And after 60 years of that performance, they voted us out anyway." The table was quiet. I said, "So the performance is over, and I think, if we handle the next 20 years correctly, that is going to turn out to be the best thing that has ever happened to us." Owen said, "How?" I said, because we have never once, in 60 years, been allowed to simply be ourselves and do what we actually do. Claire unfolded her arms. She said, the technology restrictions. I said, yes. Philip said, the conclave prohibited member species from developing independent gravitational fold research. They said it was theoretically unstable. They had a whole panel ruling on it from about 800 years ago. I said, we were bound by that ruling as provisional members. He said, we are not provisional members anymore. I said, we are not anything to them anymore, and that means we are not bound by anything they decided. The room shifted. I could feel it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Something was moving in the space between the people at that table, something that had been compressed for a long time and was now, slowly, expanding. Claire said, you have already been thinking about this. Before the vote. I said, I have been thinking about it for about 4 years. I hoped I would be wrong about the vote. I was not. She said, what do you want from us? I said, I want you to remember this conversation. I want each of you to go back to your stations and write down every idea you have ever had about what humanity could do if the conclave restrictions were simply not there. Every technology, every exploration route, every diplomatic contact we were told we were not permitted to make independently. Write all of it down. Because when we land on Earth, we are going to have a very different kind of meeting than any meeting Earth has ever had before. Philip said, they are going to be frightened back home. The governments, the councils, the agencies. Exile is going to feel like a catastrophe to most people. I said, it will feel like one for about 6 months. Then they will get angry. And then they will get to work. He said, and if they do not? I said, Philip, name one time in recorded human history when we were told something could not be done, and we collectively accepted that as a final answer. He was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, slowly, the way a person smiles when they realize they already know the answer to the question that was just asked. He said, I cannot think of one. I said, I cannot either. Owen said, what about the 16 civilizations that voted for us? They will be in a difficult position now. The conclave is not going to be happy with them. I said, the 16 are important. I want to send each of them a private transmission before we reach Earth. Not an official diplomatic communication. Something quieter. Something that simply says, thank you. And give us 20 years. He said, 20 years is a long time. I said, not for what I have in mind. Claire said, you are serious. I said, Claire, I have never been more serious about anything in my life. She looked at me for a moment. Then she opened her tablet and started typing. I went back to my communications console and began composing 17 transmissions. 16 of them were to the civilizations that had voted for us. Each one was short, warm, and deliberately vague. Thank you. We remember. Give us 20 years. The 17th transmission was to my daughter. Her name was Nadia. She was 22 years old and studying aerospace engineering at a university in Cape Town. She had her father's stubbornness and my tendency to plan 3 steps ahead of the step she was actually on. She had wanted to work in space since she was 6 years old, and she had told me once, when she was about 12, that she thought the conclave was condescending and that she did not understand why we kept trying to impress them, out of the mouths of children. I wrote to her. I said, the vote passed. I am coming home. Do not change your plans. In fact, accelerate them if you can. The next 20 years are going to need people who know how to build things. She wrote back within 6 hours. She said, I had a feeling. I am already looking at the advanced propulsion program. Also, I am angry. Is that allowed? I wrote back. I said, it is not only allowed, it is required. The remaining 28 days of the journey, I barely slept. I worked. I read every conclave restriction document we had ever been given, every technology prohibition, every no-fly region, every clause in the provisional membership agreement that had limited what Earth could do. I read them not to be sad about them. I read them as a list of everything that was now, suddenly, open. The gravitational fold research alone could reduce transit times between star systems by 30 to 40%, based on the theoretical models our own scientists had been developing quietly for 15 years, running the numbers in their spare time the way people do when they know the answer is there but are not allowed to look for it officially. There was also the question of the Keth. The conclave had flagged a methane atmosphere world called Prethys 7 about 200 years ago, noted that it appeared to contain a pre-technological civilization, and marked it as off-limits for contact, pending a full cultural assessment that had never actually been completed. It had simply been forgotten, filed and forgotten. We had not been allowed to make contact. We were provisional members. We followed the rules. We were not provisional members anymore. I wrote down, Prethys 7, contact. My list grew longer every day. When we finally broke through the upper atmosphere and landed at the Cape Town spaceport, there was no crowd waiting. There were a few agency officials, a small government liaison team, and my daughter, standing slightly apart from the official group, wearing a university jacket that was too big for her and holding a thermos of coffee. She handed me the thermos when I came down the ramp. She did not say anything for a moment. She just looked at me. Then she said, "They really did it." I said, "They really did." She said, "So what now?" I held the thermos in both hands. It was warm. The morning air in Cape Town was sharp and clean and smelled like the ocean. I said, "Now we stop asking." She looked at me. I said, "For 60 years, we asked, we applied, we appealed. We waited, we performed, we proved ourselves, and then we proved ourselves again, and then we sat in a gallery that was not even on the main floor and watched them vote to throw us out. So that is finished. We are done asking," she said. "And instead?" I said, "Instead we build. We go, we do, and we let them watch." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "How long?" I said, 20 years. She said, "I will be 42. I said, "And you will be standing somewhere no human has ever stood before. I promise you that." She looked out at the sky above the port. There were clouds moving fast across the blue, pulled by the coastal wind. She said, "I want to fly one of the new ships. Whatever we build, I want to fly it." I said, "I know." She said, "Is that allowed?" I looked at her. I said, "We are not asking for permission anymore. That is the point." She smiled at that. It was a particular kind of smile that I recognized because it was mine. Not soft, not easy, the kind of smile that is also a decision. Around us, the liaison officials were moving toward us with tablets and urgent questions. The governments of Earth had been waiting 31 days for this conversation. The agencies had reports to file. The councils had sessions scheduled. I handed the thermos back to Nadia. I said, "Stay close. I am going to need an engineer soon." She said, "I am still a student." I said, "Not for long." I walked toward the officials, already reaching for my notebook. The conclave called our silence acceptance. I called it a countdown. 22 years is a long time in human terms. It is not long in galactic terms. The Velshari elder counselor Orath had told me once, in one of our rare private conversations during my ambassadorship, that the conclave measured civilizational progress in centuries, minimum. She said it kindly, as a piece of genuine advice. She said, "Do not expect changes you can see in a single lifetime." I thought about that conversation often in the years after we came home. I thought about it especially on the morning I stood in the observation bay of the ESV Forge, watching the ship my daughter commanded slide into its launch position against the pale gray sky above the Kalahari station. The Forge was Earth's primary deep space construction vessel, and it had been in continuous operation for 8 years. Nadia was not commanding a new ship. She was commanding the newest, the one whose construction she had overseen from initial frame to final weld, a ship called the Ardent. She was 38 years old. She had her father's stubbornness, and, if I am honest, a significant amount of my stubbornness layered on top of it, which made her very difficult to argue with, and extraordinarily effective at her job. I was 66. My hair was fully gray. My knees had opinions about stairs that I had not asked for. But I was there, standing in that observation bay, and I was not tired. The Ardent was not a diplomatic vessel. It was not a science vessel. It was an exploration and contact ship, which is a category that had not existed in Earth's fleet before, because Earth's fleet had previously been built around the Conclave's idea of what human ships should be: support vessels, survey craft, nothing that could be mistaken for independent ambition. The Ardent was 140 meters long. It carried a crew of 62, a full contact and linguistics team, a medical bay designed for multi-species interaction, and a propulsion system that used the gravitational fold method that the Conclave had declared theoretically unstable 800 years ago. We had declared it theoretically brilliant 14 years ago, after 3 years of independent testing, and had been using it in our own ships ever since. The Ardent could cover in 11 days what used to take our fastest vessel 31 days. Nadia had tested the drives herself during the shakedown runs over the asteroid belt, and she had sent me a message afterward that contained exactly 4 words. She had written, "They were so wrong." I had kept that message. I had a folder of messages I kept. I was sentimental about certain things. Claire Okafor was standing beside me in the observation bay. Claire had gone from chief science advisor on a small diplomatic vessel to director of independent research at the newly formed Earth Sovereign Science Council, which was a long title for the organization that was doing everything the Conclave had previously told us we were not ready to do. She was 59 now and had not slowed down in any direction. She said, "Prethus 7. I said, "Yes." She said, "The Ardent's first assignment." I said, "Nadia briefed me last week." The linguistics team has been running models on the atmospheric signal data we collected from the Outer System probe 3 years ago. They think the Keth use a sound-based communication system, but layered, multiple simultaneous tones, like chords. Claire said, "Like music." I said, "Like music." She looked at the Ardent through the observation glass. She said, "The Conclave had that data too, 200 years ago. They looked at it and filed it." I said, "They did not think it was worth pursuing." She said, "Because a civilization that had not yet built machines was not relevant to them." I said, "Yes." She said, "And we are going to make first contact with them." I said, "Nadia is going to make first contact with them." She insisted on leading it personally. I did not argue. Claire said, "You never argue with her." I said, "I tried once. I lost." She smiled at that. Below us, through the wide observation glass, the Ardent's running lights came on in sequence, the quiet blue of its primary systems shifting to the brighter white of launch-ready status. I could hear, faintly through the sealed bay, the low tone of the station countdown. Philip Strand had not been able to make the launch. He was currently serving as Earth's senior communications strategist at what we were informally calling the Accord Project, which was the framework for everything that came after the Exile and which had no official name yet because we had not decided how official we wanted it to be. He had sent me a message that morning. He said, 22 years ago, you told us to write down every idea we had about what humanity could do without the restrictions. I still have that list. We have now done 47 of the 63 things on it. Thought you would want to know." I wrote back, "What are the other 16? He wrote back, "Give us 10 more years." The countdown reached 0. The Ardent lifted. It was not a dramatic lift, not in the way that early rocket launches had been, all noise and fire and shaking ground. Gravitational fold drives did not work that way. The Ardent simply rose, steadily, purposefully, with a quiet confidence that I thought was appropriate. Then, at the edge of the atmosphere, it folded into transit and was gone. I stood there for a moment after it vanished. Claire said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I am thinking about something my grandfather told me. He told me that the hardest part of rebuilding after a flood is not the physical work. It is convincing yourself that you have the right to rebuild, that the water does not own the ground it covered." She was quiet. I said, "We spent 60 years asking the conclave for permission to be who we are. We asked them if our way of doing things was acceptable. We adjusted, we modified, we softened, and I spent a lot of time, in the years after the exile, wondering whether we lost something in all that adjustment. Whether we had been shaped by the asking." Claire said, "And had we?" I said, "I think the exile answered that. Because the moment we stopped asking, the moment there was no audience to perform for, we just went back to being ourselves immediately. Like we had been waiting the whole time, like it was all still there, under the performance, completely unchanged." She said, "We are stubborn that way." I said profoundly. She said, "Orith's people are going to notice the FTL signatures. We have 6 ships now running gravitational fold drives on routes that cross 3 previously restricted regions of conclave space. Their monitoring systems are going to pick us up within the next few months, if they have not already." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you ready for that conversation?" I said, "Nadia is ready for that conversation. I am retired." Claire gave me a look that suggested she found this claim about my retirement unconvincing. I said, "I am mostly retired." She said, "They will call an emergency session." I said, "Let them." She said, "They may classify human ships in restricted lanes as unauthorized presences and send response vessels." I said, "Claire." She said, "Yes?" I said, "We have 14 ships. They are faster than anything in the conclave fleet. Our crews have been operating independently for 22 years, and we have a mutual defense agreement with the Hown, the Corvin Reach, the Yavari Compact, and 11 other civilizations, some of whom are current conclave members." She was quiet. I said, "I am not worried about their response vessels." She said, "Nadia briefed you." I said, "Nadia briefs me every week. She is thorough." The observation bay was quiet now. The launch pad below was going through its post-departure reset cycle, ground crews moving in organized patterns. I thought about the Keth on Prethus 7, on their methane world with their layered, harmonic language, who had been looked at by the conclave 200 years ago and deemed not worth the effort. I thought about what it would mean to them to have someone arrive and sit down and say, "We are here, and we are listening, and we think what you are doing is worth the effort." I thought about the 16 civilizations that had voted for us 22 years ago, and the quiet, careful relationships we had built with each of them in the years since. Not formal alliances first, friendships first, conversations, exchange programs, human engineers working alongside Hound scientists, human doctors on Corvin Reach stations, learning multi-species medicine, human children growing up with images of alien skies as normal parts of their education. The conclave had given us a membership structure and called it a community. We had built an actual one. I thought about the conclave's emergency session, which I knew was probably already being scheduled. Someone in their monitoring network had almost certainly already flagged the gravitational fold signatures. The paperwork was probably already moving through their 40,000-year-old procedures. And I thought about Nadia, already in transit toward Prethus 7, moving faster than anything the conclave had approved. I reached into my jacket pocket. I still carried a notebook, paper, pen, old habit. I opened it to a new page. I wrote the date. Then I wrote, "Today, we stopped being what they decided we were. Today, we became what we actually are." I paused. Then I wrote one more line. I wrote, "The interesting part starts now." The Ardent came out of fold transit at the outer edge of the Prethus system on a morning that I, 66 years old and back on Earth, experienced entirely through a time-delayed transmission feed on a screen in my home in Nairobi. The signal lag was 17 minutes each way. By the time I saw anything, it had already happened 34 minutes ago. My name is Nadia Chen. I have my mother's habit of keeping notes, my grandfather's stubbornness about finishing things I start, and I had, on the morning we arrived at Prethis 7, a very specific kind of feeling in my chest that I had no precise word for. It was not quite nervousness. It was not quite excitement. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something enormous, knowing you were about to step off, and having no clear idea what the landing would look like, but choosing to step anyway. Our linguistics lead, a woman named Petra Hollis, had been awake for approximately 30 hours before we arrived. She was one of those people who go very still when they are working at full capacity, like all her energy is being directed inward. When I walked into the contact preparation bay, she was sitting with her eyes closed and 3 audio files running simultaneously through her earpiece. I said, "Petra." She held up one finger, not rudely, the way a person holds up a finger when they are balancing something delicate and need 3 more seconds. I waited. She opened her eyes and said, "The harmonic structure is more complex than the probe data suggested. It is not just layered tones. There are rhythmic intervals between the tonal clusters that carry meaning. We have been analyzing it as music, when it is actually closer to a tonal syntax. Subject, object, intent, and emotional register are all encoded in the timing of the intervals." I said, "Can we speak it?" She said, "Not with human voices, not accurately. But we have the resonance arrays in the contact bay. If we route the output through a frequency modulator and use the array to produce the harmonic clusters, we can approximate the basic greeting and identification structures." I said, "How confident are you?" She said, "Confident enough to try. Not confident enough to promise." I said, "That is good enough for me." She looked at me and said, "They are going to know we are not Velshari, or Drenai. We are not going to sound right to them." I said, "Good. I do not want to sound like the Velshari. Or the Drenai." She smiled at that. Our approach to Prethis 7 was slow and deliberate. We had positioned the Ardent in the outer orbital range, far enough that we were not a looming presence, close enough that our contact arrays could reach the surface. The planet below was a layered amber, clouds of methane and ammonia in bands of yellow and brown, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are entirely themselves with no apology. Our science team had confirmed active surface civilization signatures in 4 locations across the northern continent. Structures, organized infrastructure, tool use, evidence of something that might have been agriculture adapted for their atmosphere. They were not primitive, they were simply different, and they were doing entirely well on their own. The Conclave had looked at this world 200 years ago and filed it. I was going to need a long time to be done being angry about that. We sent the first signal at local morning on Prethis 7. It was a simple greeting structure, built on the base tonal patterns Petra had extracted from 200 years of ambient signal data. It said, in the closest approximation we could manage, "We are here, we are not from here, we mean no harm, we would like to speak." Then we waited. 17 minutes for my mother to see us send it. 17 more for any message from her to reach us. We were on our own. The response came in 4 hours and 12 minutes. It was not what we expected. We expected something cautious, a probe signal, a repetition of our greeting structure back to us, which would be their way of saying, "We heard you, we acknowledge you." What came instead was an extended harmonic transmission, dense with tonal clusters, rhythmic intervals layered on top of each other in a pattern that Petra later described as something between a formal declaration and a greeting extended to a long-awaited guest. She played it for the crew. It filled the contact bay with something I can only describe as warmth, if warmth had a sound. It was full. It was open. It had the quality of a door being swung wide. Petra said, "This is rough. I am still parsing the full structure, but the core meaning of the first section appears to be something like, 'We have seen your lights in the sky for a very long time. We wondered when you would finally say something.'" The contact bay went completely quiet. Then Owen, who was 17 years older than when he had gripped a railing in the conclave gallery with white knuckles, and who was now serving as the Ardent's diplomatic liaison, said, "They have been watching us." Petra said, "They have been watching something in their sky. Whether they identified it as our early probe is unclear. But they were aware. They were paying attention." I thought about the conclave probe that had visited this system 200 years ago. I thought about the Velshari researchers who had looked at the data and decided this civilization was pre-relevant. I thought about the file that had been closed and never reopened. I thought about 200 years of a civilization looking up at their sky, watching lights move, and wondering if anyone would ever actually say something. I sat down in the contact chair. I said, "Petra, tell them we are sorry it took this long. Tell them we are here now. And ask them if they are willing to talk." She said, "The apology structure is going to be difficult to render accurately." I said, "Do your best. The intent matters more than the precision." She nodded and began working. 12 days later, the Ardent transmitted a full report to Earth. It included the first recorded complete communication exchange between humans and the Keth of Prethus 7, a preliminary analysis of their language structure that Petra was already describing as one of the most sophisticated tonal communication systems ever documented, an outline of what appeared to be a mutual interest in further exchange, and a single note from me at the end of the report. I wrote, "They knew we were there. They were waiting. They are extraordinary. We are not leaving until we have given them every reason to believe that the next ship that comes will be just as interested in them as we are. More to follow." My mother sent back a response after the signal delay. She wrote, "Your grandfather would have loved this. So do I. Keep going." I kept going. The conclave's emergency session was called while we were still in orbit at Prethus 7. Owen picked up the formal notification through the conclave's public broadcast system, which any vessel with a receiver could access. The session had been called under emergency procedure, and the agenda had 2 items. The first was the detection of unauthorized human FTL signatures in 3 restricted corridor regions. The second was a report from the Draenei Collective claiming that 4 current conclave member civilizations had entered into informal trade agreements with human representatives in violation of the spirit of the Exile decree. Owen handed me the notification summary. I read it. Then I handed it back. I said, "Send my mother the session announcement. She should know." He said, "And us? What do we do?" I looked out the forward viewport at the amber and yellow world below, where a civilization that had been waiting 200 years to talk to someone was currently listening to the harmonic greeting program that Petra had been refining for the past week. I said, "We stay here, we finish what we started, and when we are ready, we go to the conclave and we show them what 22 years of being left alone looks like." He said, "They are not going to like it." I said, "Owen, did they like us before?" He thought about that. He said, "No." I said, "Then we have nothing to lose and everything to show them." He went back to his station. I opened my notebook, the same habit my mother had given me without ever formally teaching me, and I wrote the date and the coordinates of Prethus 7 and the words, "First real conversation." They were waiting. We finally showed up. Then I wrote, "The conclave is meeting. We are also meeting. Ours is more interesting." I closed the notebook. Below the Ardent, the planet turned slowly in the amber light of its sun, patient and alive and full of language we were only beginning to understand. We were not going anywhere. We had found something worth staying for. The conclave grand chamber, when I walked onto its main floor for the first time in my life, looked exactly as it had from the gallery 22 years ago, except for one significant difference. My name is Nadia Chen. I am 38 years old. I command the ESV Ardent, and when I walked through those doors onto the main floor, I did not walk through the observer entrance. I walked through the delegate entrance, because I was not an observer. I had not been invited to come. I had simply come. The Ardent and 4 escort ships had dropped out of Fold transit 12 hours earlier at a point inside what the Conclave called the Aegis Corridor, a navigational security perimeter surrounding the Vareth system that was built on the assumption that only Conclave-authorized vessels could navigate it, because only Conclave-authorized vessels had access to the corridor's beacon network. We did not use the beacon network, we used our own. Gravitational fold navigation does not require external beacons, it requires precise calculation, which our navigational team had been practicing on restricted corridors for 3 years. We mapped the corridor ourselves. Quietly. On survey runs that the Conclave's monitoring network interpreted as standard transit traffic. When we came out of Fold inside the Aegis corridor, I opened a hailing frequency on every channel the Conclave used and said, simply, "We would like to talk." Then I waited. The response, when it came, was not hostile. It was confused. And then, as the full picture of what had just happened became clear to the Conclave's security apparatus, it became something close to alarmed. They had no legal mechanism for what we had done. We were an exiled civilization. Exiled civilizations had no standing to appear before the Conclave. They were supposed to be gone, filed and gone. The Conclave's 40,000-year-old procedural framework did not have a form for this situation. I thought that was quite funny. They let us dock. I think they let us dock partly because they had no clear process for refusing us, partly because 3 of their most senior member civilizations quietly recommended they hear us out, and partly because the Ardent and its escort ships were sitting inside their supposedly impenetrable security perimeter, and the implicit conversation that created was one the Conclave did not want to have in a more direct form. Owen walked beside me as we moved through the station corridor toward the Grand Chamber. He said, "I was here 22 years ago, in the gallery." I said, "I know. My mother told me." He said, "She gripped her notebook the whole time and never showed them a single thing she was feeling." I said, "She taught me that." He said, "Are you going to do the same?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "No. I am going to show them exactly what I am feeling. I think it will be more useful." He looked at me. I said, "My mother's job was to be patient. Mine is to be clear." We entered the Grand Chamber. The delegates were already assembled. All 214 civilizations, their representatives seated in the spiral arrangement that had not changed in 40,000 years. The dome above was a pale blue, lit by Varath Prime's reflected light. It was exactly as my mother had described it, beautiful, formal, and deeply convinced of its own permanence. I walked to the center of the floor. No one had assigned me a position. There was no nameplate, no designated spot. I stood in the middle and I looked around the room. Counselor Orath was in her seat. She looked older, not dramatically older. The Velshari were long-lived, but there was something in her bearing that had changed slightly. Something in the way she held her 4 hands. I could not tell if it was uncertainty or something else. She said, "Captain Chen, you have no standing to address this body. You represent an exiled civilization." I said, "I represent humanity, and I am standing on your floor, so I will address this body." The room was not quiet. The room was full of overlapping sound, delegates speaking to each other, to their translation systems, to their adjacent colleagues. I waited. I had practiced waiting from a very young age. After a moment, Counselor Orath raised her hand, and the chamber quieted. She said, "You have 3 minutes by conclave convention for an unauthorized address." I said, "I will take less." I pulled out a document, paper, the same kind my mother had used for 22 years of notes. I set it on the floor in front of me because there was no table and I was not going to ask for one. I said, 22 years ago, this body voted to exile humanity on the grounds that we were too aggressive, too disorganized, too emotional, and too unpredictable to be trusted with membership. I want to update you on what we have done with the time since. I listed it. I did not rush. I spoke at a measured pace, clearly, in the conclave's common tongue. 7 new human colony worlds, fully established, self-sustaining, with combined populations exceeding 400 million. 3 new civilizations contacted, documented, and in active partnership with humanity, including the Keth of Prethus 7, who the Conclave classified as pre-relevant 2 centuries ago and never contacted. An independent trade network currently servicing 11 species, 4 of whom are current Conclave members who participate voluntarily. A gravitational fold propulsion system that our engineers developed from theoretical models the Conclave declared unstable, which has been in operational use for 8 years with a perfect safety record. A mutual support framework with 14 civilizations, some inside this body, some outside it, built on voluntary partnership rather than hierarchical membership requirements. The chamber was quiet now. I said, I am not here to ask for readmission. I want to be clear about that immediately. We are not asking, we are informing. Counselor Orath said, informing us of what? I reached down, picked up the paper document from the floor, and walked toward her table. I set it in front of her. I said, we have drafted a framework we are calling the Accord of Mutual Passage. It establishes how humanity intends to operate in this part of the galaxy going forward. We are sharing it with you as a courtesy, not a legal obligation. She looked at the document. She did not touch it yet. I said, the accord states the following. Earth does not recognize conclave jurisdiction over human vessels, human colonies, or our allied species. Human ships will respect conclave space voluntarily, as a courtesy, because we are not hostile and have no interest in conflict. Any species that wishes to trade with us may do so freely, regardless of their conclave membership status. Any species that requests our assistance in a crisis may receive it, regardless of conclave political considerations. A delegate from the Drenai Collective said, you cannot simply declare your own rules. I said, I understand why you think that. The Conclave has operated for 40,000 years on the principle that rules must be granted by consensus of established powers before they are legitimate. I am telling you that we do not operate on that principle. The Drenai delegate said, then on what principle do you operate? I said, on the principle that the act of doing something, and doing it well, and continuing to do it, is its own legitimacy. We built the ships, we made the contacts, we established the agreements, we developed the technology. We did all of it without asking permission, and it works, and it is real, and it exists regardless of what this body decides about it. The chamber was very still. I said, you voted us out 22 years ago because you did not believe we were capable of responsible independent action. We would like to thank you for that vote, because it removed every restriction on what we could do, and what we did with that freedom is standing in this room and setting a document on your table. Counselor Orath was looking at me. She had very still, pale eyes. I held her gaze without effort. She said, and if we do not accept this accord, I said, then we will operate exactly as we have been operating, because the accord simply describes what we are already doing. Your acceptance changes nothing about our behavior. It only changes whether we can say we told you. A long silence. Then Counselor Orath picked up the document. She said quietly, the words almost private, you cannot simply declare your own rules. I looked at her. I thought about my mother in the gallery. I thought about my grandfather's village and the flood. I thought about 60 years of asking and performing and adjusting. I thought about the Keth of Prethus 7, who had been watching the sky for 200 years and wondering when someone would finally say something. I said, Counselor, we just did. I turned and walked back toward the delegate entrance. Owen fell into step beside me. He said quietly, that was not 3 minutes. I said, I know. I used 2. He said, they are going to talk about this for years. I said, I know. Let them. We walked out of the grand chamber. Behind us, the room erupted into the loudest sound I had heard in my life. 214 civilizations, all speaking at once. I did not look back. My name is Yara Chen. I am 66 years old, and I am watching my daughter change the world from a chair in my living room in Nairobi, with a cup of tea that has gone cold in my hands and a feeling in my chest that I do not have a clean word for. The feed from the conclave chamber reached me 34 minutes after Nadia walked out. I watched the whole thing on a delay. I watched her stand in the center of that floor, without a nameplate, without a designated position, without an invitation. I watched her set a piece of paper down in the middle of the most powerful political chamber in this part of the galaxy, because there was no table, and she was not going to ask for one. I watched Councillor Orath pick up that document. I sat very still in my chair for a long time after the feed ended. Then I opened my notebook. The same paper notebook I had carried since the day of the vote, 22 years ago. I had gone through several of them. This was the fourth. I had transferred the key passages from each previous notebook into the new one, so the record was continuous. I wrote the date. I wrote, she walked onto the main floor. She placed the accord on the table. She said what needed to be said, and then she left. Then I wrote, I am not sure there are enough words for how proud I am right now, so I will not try to find them. I closed the notebook. Outside my window, Nairobi was in its late afternoon light, the kind of golden hour that makes everything look like it is lit from inside. I could hear the street sounds, the ordinary sounds of a city going about its business, people and traffic, and somewhere in the distance, something that sounded like music from an open window. In the 7 months following Nadia's appearance at the conclave, the accord gained 6 signatories, 4 of them current conclave members. They did not resign their conclave membership, they simply also signed ours. The conclave's legal framework had no provision for member civilizations entering into parallel agreements with exiled species, because the conclave had never imagined that an exiled species would produce something worth entering into parallel agreements with. Philip called me 2 months after the conclave session. He said, we are at 59 of the 63 things on the original list, 4 remaining. I said, what are the 4? He said, 2 involve technology that we are still about 3 years from completing. 1 involves a diplomatic situation with a civilization in the outer galactic arm that is going to require a lot of patience, and 1 is yours. I said, which one is mine? He said, the private meeting with Councillor Orath that you have been declining to schedule for 8 months. I said, I have not been declining, I have been timing it. He said, and? I said, now is the right time. The meeting happened 12 days later, conducted via secure transmission because neither of us was willing to travel to the other. Orath appeared on my screen in the quiet light of whatever time it was on Verath Prime. She looked like she had aged, not in body, but in something else. In certainty, maybe. The absolute, practiced certainty that had made her so formidable in that chamber 22 years ago had shifted into something more considered. She said, Ambassador Chen, or I suppose it is former ambassador now. I said, Yara is fine. She said, I have been thinking about something since your daughter's visit. I have been thinking about it for months. I want to ask you a direct question. I said, go ahead. She said, why did you not argue against the exile? On the day of the vote, and in the months before it when the charges were being assembled. You were a skilled diplomat. Some of the member civilizations were genuinely persuadable. You could have made the case for humanity. You chose not to. Why? I leaned back in my chair. I said, because we had been making the case for humanity for 60 years, Counselor. 60 years of arguments and reports, and evidence and appeals, and cultural presentations, and diplomatic courtesy. 60 years of performing a version of ourselves that we calculated would be acceptable to this body, and I spent a great deal of those 11 years watching that performance, and I could see, clearly, that it was not working. Not because our arguments were weak, because we were arguing for the wrong thing. She said, what do you mean? I said, we were arguing to be let in. We were asking for permission to exist in galactic society, And the fundamental problem with that position is that it requires you to define us. It requires us to fit into your framework, your categories, your idea of what a responsible civilization looks like, and we do not fit into those categories. We never did. Not because we are worse than them, because we are different from them, and you had no category for what we actually are. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "And what are you?" I thought about how to answer that. I had been thinking about how to answer that for 22 years. I said, "We are a species that evolved under so much pressure, for so long, that we developed something that I think is genuinely unusual in the galaxy. We do not give up, not as individuals, not as communities, not as a civilization. We have a particular relationship with adversity that I do not think we fully understood ourselves until you gave us the chance to experience it without an audience." She said, "The Exile." I said, "The Exile was the first time in 60 years that we did not have to perform, that we did not have to translate ourselves into something acceptable for outside observers. We just went home and became what we actually are, and what we actually are, it turns out, is this." I gestured, slightly, a vague gesture toward everything, toward Nadia, and the Ardent, and the Keth of Prethus 7, and the Accord, and the 14 ships, and the 7 colony worlds. Counselor Orath was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The conclave is going to change, not because of you, not entirely, but the fact of you is forcing conversations that have not happened in a very long time, about whether 40,000 years of the same procedures still serve the purpose they were designed to serve." I said, "I think that is a good conversation to have." She said, "You are not going to come back to the conclave, are you? Not as members, not formally." I said, "No, I do not think membership under the current structure is what we need or want. We are not opposed to the conclave, we are not its enemy. We are something it does not have a category for, which is a civilization that participates in galactic society on its own terms, alongside others but not beneath them." She said, "You want to be equals." I said, "We want what every civilization in that chamber wants and does not always say out loud. We want to be respected. We want to be taken seriously. We want to be permitted to engage with the rest of the galaxy as ourselves, not as a performance of ourselves, edited for your comfort." She said, "We were not kind to you." I said, "No, but you gave us something that, in the end, was worth more than kindness. You gave us the freedom to stop asking." Another long silence. She said, "What do you want now?" "From us. From the conclave." I picked up my cold cup of tea. I held it in both hands. I said, "The same thing we have always wanted. We want to be out there. We want to find what is next. We want to help where we can. We want to be left alone when we cannot. We want to trade fairly with whoever is willing to trade with us. We want to talk to civilizations that have been sitting on methane worlds for thousands of years, watching lights move in their sky, wondering if anyone will ever say something. We want to keep building." I said, "We do not need your permission for any of that. We have proven that. But we would very much prefer your friendship, because a galaxy that is working together is more interesting than a galaxy that is just working. And humans, whatever else we are, find the interesting thing irresistible." Counselor Orath looked at me through the screen. She said, "You are a strange people." I said, "We genuinely are. We have made peace with that." Something shifted in her expression. It was not quite a smile. The Velshari did not smile in the same way, but it was something in that direction. She said, "I will recommend, through private channels, that 3 currently undecided member civilizations give serious consideration to signing your accord." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Do not thank me. I am doing it because I believe it is sensible, not as a kindness." I said, "I know. That is why I am thanking you." She disconnected. I sat for a moment with the cold cup of tea. Then I stood up and walked to my back door and stepped outside. The evening air in Nairobi was warm and soft, carrying the smell of rain that had fallen earlier and the green smell that comes after. Above the city, The sky was darkening toward night, the first stars becoming visible at the edges. One of those stars, I knew, was in the rough direction of Prethus 7, where the Ardent was still in orbit, and where Petra Hollis was still working on the full linguistic map of the Keth tonal system, and where two civilizations were in the early stages of figuring out what they had to offer each other. One of those stars was in the rough direction of our 7 colony worlds, each one different, each one adapted, each one proof that humans had found a way to not need a planet to be born on in order to call a planet home. One of those stars was in the rough direction of the Haln home system, where a human engineering team had been working alongside Haln scientists for 11 years, and where the first jointly developed gravitational fold vessel, designed by both species together, was 3 months from its launch date. I looked up at all of it. Behind me, in the house, I could hear my communicator signaling an incoming message. Probably Philip, possibly Nadia, definitely someone with something to report, some new development, some next step in a process that felt less like a plan now and more like a living thing, growing in directions we had not fully predicted, and that was exactly right. I did not go inside immediately. I stayed outside for another minute. I thought about a young woman in a gallery, writing in a notebook while 214 civilizations voted to throw her planet away. I thought about 31 days on a ship, writing lists of everything we were now free to do. I thought about a daughter standing in the middle of the most powerful chamber in this part of the galaxy, without a nameplate, without permission, setting a piece of paper on a table and saying, "We just did." I thought about the Keth, who had waited 200 years for someone to say something. I thought about my grandfather's village, and the flood, and the 4 months, and the people standing in the water, not sitting down. I thought about what it means when a species that has been told it cannot do something simply goes and does it anyway. Not out of anger, not out of recklessness, but out of something quieter and more durable. Out of the deep, stubborn, irrepressible conviction that the work matters, that the people matter, that the next horizon is worth moving toward. They voted to exile us from the galaxy. We took that vote and we built something they had not imagined. Not a civilization that wanted to dominate, not a power that wanted to replace what was already there. Something simpler and, I think, stranger than either of those things. A humanity that had finally stopped waiting to be let in. A humanity that had learned, at last, how to let itself out. I went inside. I picked up the communicator. I said, "Yes, I am here. Tell me everything." And we kept going.